fiction, science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery with your hosts, Eric Shapiro, David North Martino, John Copenhaver, and Al Warren. Heard on KCOQ 106.5 FM Los Angeles,
102.3 FM Riverside,
and 105.0 AM Palm Springs.
Welcome back into the House of Mystery. I'm Al Warren. Mr. Joe Goldberg, how you doing?
I'm doing fine, Al. New year, new adventures. Let's let it rip.
Yeah. Did you stay up for New Year's? Watch the
No.
balls drop?
We looked at each other and went, boy, are we old. We were at somebody's house and we all looked at each other and said, game over. We all just took off.
Yeah. Yeah, there's that 1 year that comes in your life when all of a sudden you're going home at 9:00.
Yep. It wasn't soon after. It's like, oh, here's some champagne. Oh, yeah, okay, fine, great.
Yeah.
I'm tired.
Yeah. Yeah.
We've reached the stage.
Yeah. You know, it's just because it's not that important. Another year closer to death.
Yes. Yes. We had a good start. We had a good start of the year for a show with me. You know.
Well, there
Death
you go.
hangs out there. The end is closer than the beginning, as they said in Network by Patty Chayefsky.
Yeah. Yeah. And quite a few people showed us that over the holiday there.
Yeah, it's sad. Sad.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy. It all comes at once. Seems to come in waves, you know.
It does.
But I think the Lisa Marie Presley was the most surprising.
Shocking. Since you saw her the night before, or even in the clips from the Golden Globes, there she was. And then less than 48 hours later, there she wasn't.
She didn't look too good in those clips.
Yeah.
You know, they were like holding her up and she seemed very shaky and
something.
There's something going on. I kind of thought that was unusual, but it's how it goes.
One victory. I did win $2 on the Mega Billion Dollar lottery.
Oh.
So I got that going for me.
So you're going to retire?
It's in my pocket. I'm framing it.
Yeah, that's a good thing. Well, speaking of $2, no. So we've got an author. He's got quite a few different types of books. He's got his hands in all sorts of different fiction novels here. It's really interesting, kind of historical and all sorts of stuff going on. So all the way from across the pond, as they say, we've got Mr. William Ryan. So thank you for being on the show.
I'm very pleased to be here. William,
now I've noticed that you've got William and W.C. Ryan. So is that like, if you got like split personality going on, or what's happening here?
I do. I have two names I'm published under, but actually most of my friends call me Bill. So I've got a three-way split going on. So, but
is there an advantage to that? Do you find, have you done that for a reason? Like, do different people go for different names or something? Or
I think there's a publishing reason for it. So I moved publisher, and they kind of wanted to send me in a slightly different direction. So my first four novels, three of them were set in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. One was set in World War II in Nazi Germany, and they wanted me to kind of go, and I wanted to go in a slightly different direction with something a little bit more lighthearted and a little bit more fun. So when I wrote House of Ghosts, we agreed that I would do it as W.C. Ryan, and it would be kind of a little bit of a break.
Yeah, no, it kind of makes sense a little bit, you know, if you think about it. You seem to be really into historical sort of fictions, like you're really into things of the past, like you were saying with the novels set in the Soviet Union. Now they're set in the 1930s, I believe, isn't it?
That's right. Well, I think the past is always kind of interesting, and it's slightly fixed. Although when you look at it a little bit more detail, you find out things that you weren't expecting to. Whereas I think the contemporary world is changing very quickly, and people who wrote novels 20 years ago, now they're, it's before the internet really kicked off, before mobile phones really, cell phones really took over the world. So, kind of things change very quickly. I think with historical fiction, people can look back on it and they can say that's an interesting place. It's a little bit like travel writing to an extent, except you're taking people not only to a different place, but to a different time. And from my point of view, at least, it's a little bit more manageable than the contemporary world, which is, for me at least, quite confusing and sometimes worrying.
William, I might run on the historical fiction thing, because I think that might be my next step after I do espionage. When you're writing in the history, are you looking for parallels or themes to the current time that people can latch onto? You've done you do religion, or you do a power of people, or the situation of people. Then do you want them to attach on and say, hey, I recognize that in today's world? Or is that just not there?
I always have a theme, but kind of sometimes it's not really quite as visible as you might think at first. And sometimes it's completely personal to me, and it's not really, the reader knows it's there because I have this thing going on underneath the surface. They don't necessarily know what it is, but it makes a difference to the novel. But sometimes it's a little bit more on the surface. So with the Soviet Union, for example, one of the things I was thinking about was, at that stage you had a population that was heavily monitored. Kind of everything that people said was considered and was, looked at in case it showed signs of resistance to Soviet power. And one of the things that I had going on in my mind was actually, kind of, and we see it today in some countries, the level of surveillance that is available to governments today is hundreds of times more than existed in the 1930s. So, it's kind of fascinating to me, and it's interesting what's happened with Russia in the last, kind of 15 years since I started writing those novels, in that it's shifted back a lot more towards how it was in the Soviet Union, with people being arrested and thrown into prison for, for example, calling the Ukraine war a war, or showing any kind of resistance to Putin's government. And you kind of know that they now have tools to, kind of the first thing they do when they capture somebody is take their phone, because they know that their phone stores all kinds of information about where they've been geographically, kind of who they've been speaking to, what they've been looking at, kind of what they photographed. So and that's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what, kind of countries can do. So that was certainly something that was going on in the background.
Understood. Thank you.
What made you choose Russia to go back to? And there must have been a lot of research involved in that as well, to kind of try to capture, let's say, Moscow in 1937 and stuff, like to get a full picture of what was going on around your characters.
Well, I think Russia Moscow in the 1930s is a place that has been documented quite heavily, both at the time and subsequently. Particularly after the end of the Soviet Union, all this information came out that we hadn't seen before from the archives. So I couldn't have written those novels before, kind of 1990, when the archives were beginning to open up, or 1992. But once that, for a period of about 20 years, we had access to all of the NKVD state security files. We had access to all kinds of other things as well. You could I mean, I have about 400 books, on the Soviet Union on various different aspects. And, you know, it's absolutely fascinating. It's, you know, kind of, it sort of sucks you in to an extent, and it's an absolutely incredible, time and place. So for an ordinary person to live in 1930s Moscow, they kind of had to have a split personality. They had their public persona, which my detective, Captain Korolev, has, which is that he's a loyal member of the Communist Party. And he does think that the Soviet Union is heading in the right direction. He can see that it's a world power. He can see that there, you know, kind of things are improving for people like him. But there's another side when he looks around and he sees that his friends are being arrested, and he sees that, you know, kind of one day, you know, kind of Germany is the enemy, the next day Germany is your best friend. You know, there's a certain amount of, it's very much like 1984, which Orwell was definitely talking about the Soviet Union, you know, the fact that heavily propaganda, driven government where, you know, one day black is black, the next day black is white. And so lots of things for me to work with as a writer, particularly when you're writing a crime novel, because crime novels are about truth and justice, and the Soviet Union was not really about truth and justice, quite the opposite. So, he's a kind of lonely man, you know, kind of treading a difficult road, and that's always good fun for a crime novel.
You mentioned 400 books on the Soviet Union. Your other books are 1921, 1917, interesting years. When you were doing that research, how do you balance the historical part, I hate to use genre terms, historical part and the fiction part? Do you say, you know, that didn't happen, but I'm going to fictionalize it anyway, and someone's going to do research and say, no, William, you know, that didn't happen, you bad boy, you bad writer. Does that factor into your research as you're putting these things together?
I think you always make, you know, you're always going to making a mistake. I mean, one thing I learned, you know, kind of from my first book was never give any details about guns, because I live in a country where we don't have very many guns. So I'm kind of researching it from, you know, kind of internet ads. But somewhere in the United States, there is a man who owns that gun,
yep,
and who will come on Amazon or send you an email and tell you exactly what you've got wrong.
Yep.
And that just happens. So now I just kind of say, it's a gun. He shot it.
Yes.
But
classic.
But the other stuff, I mean, I do a lot of research. I try and know as much as I can about the time and place, but often the things that I'm looking for, it's not really big history, it's little history. So I want to kind of know what food people ate, you know, kind of what they did for entertainment, you know, how they lived their life day to day. You know, what life was like for an ordinary person in the Soviet Union or in the Irish War of Independence or in, you know, Nazi Germany, how they got by on a day-to-day basis, how they got around, you know, kind of, just all those tiny little details. And I'm sure I get things wrong because they're difficult to research, but, you know, I think I don't do too bad a job. Certainly, The Holy Thief, which was the first of the Soviet novels, was published in Russia, so I thought that was probably a fairly good sign.
Yeah, that's right. Validation.
Yeah. And they didn't come after you, did they?
No, not so far. It was actually published by a Ukrainian publisher, so does that really count anymore? I'm not so sure.
Let's not go there.
Yeah.
But it was published in Russian, so.
Nice. Well, did you get any surprises? Were there things you learned about the Soviet Union at that time that you didn't realize was happening, or the way people were?
Yeah, lots of stuff. Like, I didn't know that jazz was really big in the Soviet Union, which it was. And I found this book, which was about, you know, kind of, it was called Red Hot and Jazz, and it was about jazz musicians in the Soviet Union. And one of them happened to play a lot in a hotel where I set some of the first novel, The Holy Thief. And I thought, well, you know what? I'm I'm going to run with that and use that as the background for a scene. Because quite often, kind of when you're writing a novel, you've got things which need to happen, but it's not, like somebody needs to talk to a witness or they need to meet somebody, but you have options when it comes to where they do it. So there was a big amusement park in Moscow called Gorky Park, which you probably remember from the movie and the Martin Cruz Smith novel.
Yeah.
So, kind of that's a backdrop for something. The jazz came in. I had lots of really good first-hand accounts of football games. And I knew some stuff about, kind of hooligans in the 1930s. And I thought, well, that's another aspect. I also found out about, kind of Russian criminals and, kind of, they call themselves the thieves. They're a little bit like the mafia, but it's more complicated than that. Kind of, and tattoos are very important to them. And so your tattoos, if you're certainly during that period, if your tattoos often, you have finger tattoos and chest tattoos and leg tattoos and knee tattoos, and they tell your criminal history. And, the first question you were asked when you arrived in a prison was, do you stand by your tattoos? So in other words, have you done all the things that your fingers, say you have? And if you're making stuff up, then those tattoos are actually forcibly removed in a very unpleasant way. Whereas, kind of, Soviet bureaucracy wasn't always as reliable as, kind of what was visible on somebody's fingers. So if somebody says on their finger that they've murdered somebody, then they probably have. So,
when you're doing stuff like this, it's almost an espionage case. This case, I wonder, do you find it much different than the Cold War time and the way people acted undercover, so to speak? I'm trying to find the right wording, but was this very similar to after the war?
I think all of my novels have an espionage element. So, I mean, my period so far at least is 1917 to 1945. So I haven't quite gone as far as the Cold War period, but the kind of the 1930s in Russia, it's internal espionage to a large extent, but there's always, the fear of foreign espionage. So Korolev, my detective, whether he likes it or not, is caught up with state security quite a lot. And the last two novels that I've written, which one was set in the First World War, and one was set, the latest one, The Winter Guest, which is just out in the US, is set in the Irish War of Independence, and both of those have a protagonist who is a straightforward spy, I guess. One for the British government, the other against the British government.
Well, let's stay on those two books. Both those books have a spiritual element, ghosts and seances. How does that why? How did you mix these different things together? Historical fiction and kind of crime and ghosts.
I think with a House of Ghosts, I was talking to my publisher. It's the same editor I've had the way through, but it was a different publisher. So I was talking to her about, we were looking at trying to take a slightly different direction. And so I thought it might be kind of fun to write about an Irish man who is working for the British Secret Service during the First World War. But his loyalties are, after the Easter Rising in 1916, where, there was a small revolution in Dublin against British rule, his loyalties are much more complicated than they would have been before that event. So he's no longer quite so sure where he stands. And there's an element of that in the novel. And then, kind of when we were looking at where we might set it, and we kind of wanted to kind of have a a country house mystery with a little bit of a twist, and you know, there was quite a lot about spiritualism going on in the First World War, and that formed an element of the story for various reasons. You know, kind of we had a German spiritualist, or a Russian spiritualist who was involved in the story and had some possible nefarious background. And then it just kind of made sense to me that, you know, kind of if you've got somebody who is possibly pretending to be in contact with ghosts, then you actually have somebody who sees ghosts the whole time. They're just a normal part of her life. And as it happened when I was at university, I had a very close friend, and they had a mirror in their family that the story was that the women of the family could see events before they happened. And I thought that was that might be something which would be fun to play around with, and to play around with that idea that you could, you know, kind of, you have this house which is on this island, which is built on top of a monastery and is just full of ghosts. It's just, you know, we're having a little bit of fun with it, and we threw in the spies, threw in a little bit of romance, and I enjoyed writing it. It was a lot of fun, and I think people have really enjoyed reading it as well.
Well, and so have you had your own experiences with the paranormal or supernatural that you kind of have put into the book?
I've had some very strange experiences. I went to my latest novel, The Winter Guest, is set in Ireland in the 1920s, and I went to a school in a castle that used to be belonged to a wealthy family whose daughter was killed in the Irish War of Independence in an IRA ambush by accident. And you know, kind of, her ghost was meant to appear. There were other ghosts associated with this house, and a lot of the old big houses that belonged to the Anglo-Irish Protestant ascendancy in Ireland have these ghosts attached to them. And I certainly stayed in one where I had a couple of really weird experiences. I was in it's now a writer's retreat, but I was in it one night when, you know, somebody was walking backwards and forwards above my room for the whole night. And, you know, the next morning I asked, who is in that room? There's nobody in that room. And then, you know, kind of another time I stayed there, you know, kind of I was in bed, and somebody came outside my room, which used to be a doorway, and was very upset, and was, you know, kind of, was reciting this old Irish prayer, waiting for somebody. And, you know, kind of, it wasn't anybody in the house. So that was a strange experience as well.
Run.
Yeah. And loads of people, this particular house, is in County Monaghan, in a place called Anamakerrig. Lots of people have had strange experiences there, but it may, you know, kind of, could it have a rational explanation? Quite possibly. But, you know, if you asked me whether I believe in ghosts, I think I do to an extent. I think that there is sometimes, when there's a very traumatic event, it leaves behind like a recording that plays. But I think since the arrival of electricity, maybe ghosts aren't quite as prevalent as they were. But they're still lurking in some dark corners.
That's actually interesting. It's good
Yeah,
theory.
like a stone tape theory. Isn't that what they call it? The stone tape theory or something? When something murderous or very traumatic happens, the emotion of the murder and whatever is absorbed into the area, into the house.
That kind of makes sense to me. Do I believe it? Maybe 75%. But there's 25% myself that is very skeptical. But is it fun to write ghost stories, and is it kind of something to play around with? Because both those novels involve soldiers with post-traumatic stress from the First World War. So again, kind of Siegfried Sassoon describes seeing mounds of corpses as he's walking along Piccadilly, and he just kind of finds himself stepping over them. He knows they're not there, but they're completely visible to him. Siegfried Sassoon being the famous war poet. So this is something that he actually recounts. And, kind of lots of people who suffer post-traumatic stress, kind of in various different wars have had very similar experiences. So with The Winter Guest in particular, the main character has these, kind of waking dreams, which form part of his life, and he just sort of has to maneuver himself around them.
You didn't start as a writer. You started in another profession. You're a lawyer? And
I was a lawyer.
Yes, the British word or the non-American word for lawyer. And you became a writer. So what were your influences? Because I see Agatha Christie mentioned in the haunted house or locked rooms or the 10 Little Indians kind of style. Was that one of your influences when you started writing? Did you read a lot of that?
I definitely read. I think the reason I became a writer was because I used to read an awful lot, particularly when I was young, and I certainly I've worked my way through all of those Agatha Christie, so they're kind of part of my writing DNA, as are Dorothy L. Sayers, Nyayo Marsh,
Yes.
all of those classic crime writers, all of whom, interestingly, are women. So they were there, and they're tended to write. It was contemporary for them, but they're writing in my period. So that's always kind of useful for me. But other writers like Martin Cruz Smith certainly was an influence when it came to the Soviet Union. Philip Kerr, his Bernie Gunther novels,
Yes.
are fantastic. There are lots of very, very good historical novelists around. And when I started writing, I think my first attempt at a novel was it was maybe more literary, and I got about 40 or 50,000 words into it, and I took a step back and had a look at it and thought, this is not a book that I would pick up in a bookshop. So, I think when you're writing a novel, you really have to be writing it for yourself. You really need to be writing the book that nobody else has written yet, but you want to find in the bookshop, and because, you're reading it as you're writing it, and you can decide which way the story goes. And that's kind of, I think, the way to approach it. I liked historical fiction. I like crime fiction. I happen to have done a chunk of research into a 1930s Soviet writer called Isaac Babel, and it just, for a screenplay idea, and it just made sense to me to kind of, to run with that, and to, once I thought about the idea of writing a detective novel in the Soviet Union, it just, as I said before, they're about truth and justice crime novels, about finding the resolution to crimes that are being committed and putting the guilty people in jail. And the Soviet Union didn't always work that way. So it was fertile ground for, planting a novel.
Yeah, it gives people kind of a sense of justice if you have novels where people, the bad guy gets something happens to them,
I think crime fiction it's all about that, kind of, I think we explore our fears of, kind of violence in the street, or, kind of in the family, or whatever it is, we explore them, but it's done in a very controlled way. And we know that at the end, by and large, the detective is going to find the guilty person, and everything is going to be put to right. And, no matter how violent they are and how thrilling, it's all managed within those 350, 400 pages. And I think that's what's nice about a crime novel. But, maybe my Soviet novels are a little bit different in that there's not always the resolution that you would expect, but there is some kind of resolution.
Right. Do you actually plan out, do you sort of sit there and plot or have kind of a theme or a meaning or some sort of thing that you want people to get out of the book besides the entertainment value?
Yeah, there's always stuff going on underneath the surface, and sometimes there are things that are just on my mind generally, but sometimes they're, kind of certainly with the winter guest. I was looking at Irish history. When I grew up in Ireland, and we tended to learn history from the victor's point of view, I guess, from the because the Catholic majority in Southern Ireland. We looked back and we had the heroic IRA fighting against, kind of the evil British. But the reality of the situation was a little bit more complex. Kind of when you actually looked at what happened and what people did, sometimes it wasn't always glorious, and sometimes, kind of some of the things that were done were not, kind of quite as we had been told. And so that was kind of interesting for me as a writer to go back and look at it from a different perspective, and maybe, kind of consider how people who had been in Ireland for 400, sometimes longer, they were effectively Irish, but they were from a different social class and a different religion, and they no longer felt welcome in their own country, and I think that was something that was very sad and tragic in a way, and that's something that I wanted to explore in The Winter Guest. But some of my other novels, The Constant Soldier, that's coming out next year, which is about an ordinary soldier who comes back to his home village and finds that there's a rest hut for the officers and men from Auschwitz, and that somebody he knew is a prisoner there. And that novel is about ordinary people, and because all of the SS were ordinary people, kind of the commandant of Auschwitz trained to be a confectioner, the one before him trained to be a priest, another one was a bookkeeper, another one was a bank teller, another one was a photographer's assistant. They all had very mundane careers, but when Hitler came to power, kind of people, got swept up with it, and they made decisions, and kind of maybe the decision was to join the SS because it wasn't the military, but it kind of lots of lawyers joined it. It was considered to be maybe good for your career. And then you kind of, you've taken a step, and it's a wrong step, but it leads to another step and another step and another step. And you go from being an ordinary person to being something quite different, and you're involved in this industrial scale murder, and you're kind of killing millions of people. And but at the end of the day, those people who were doing that, they didn't set out to do that when they left school. And for me, that was something that I really wanted to explore, and I thought it was really relevant when I was writing it, because, kind of you had, around the world, you had people who, were, kind of threatening to do things to other people. And, there was a rise of autocrats, shall we say. And I kind of wanted to remind myself and maybe remind other people that, kind of, you always have a choice, and you always have to make your own choice, and you always have to take your own personal responsibility for your actions, and you have to be moral. There is something called good, there is something called evil. You have to make a moral decision each time kind of you cheer somebody at a rally, or, you're faced with a difficult decision at work, or, kind of you meet somebody in a kind of confrontational situation. There's always a right thing to do. Sometimes it's not the easiest thing to do, but, but once I think for those people who were involved in Nazi Germany, obviously there were some very evil people at the top, but there were a lot of people who got swept up with that. And I thought that was something that was worth exploring in a novel.
Well, you sort of hit on my next question that was rattling through my brain. Your writing, it seems, from the idea of everybody has a story, and you're sort of the storyteller. Am I misinterpreting some of what you're seeing as you're writing, what you're feeling as you're writing?
Well, I think, I write about ordinary people in extraordinary times and in extraordinary situations, but I think that's all fiction. We want to tell interesting stories. But I think if you look at, the places where I've set my novels, like the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany and the First World War and the Irish War of Independence, they're interesting times. And they're going to force ordinary people into difficult situations, and that's all good for writing novels and writing fun novels as well. I mean, novels, they might not be fun as such, but they're certainly going to be interesting for the reader, and they're certainly going to be engaging. And when I get reviews in newspapers, the word that comes up again and again, and one which I'm very proud of and I have absolutely no shame about, is that they're gripping. And, my ideal novel is one that I pick up and I put it down when I've finished it. It's one that just sucks you into that world. And that's kind of what I try to do with my novels as well. I really want to grip the reader and hold them till the last page.
I would imagine each novel that you go through, that you write, it sounds like it's very important, very emotional. So I'd imagine each one would actually change you in some aspect.
I think that's true. I definitely felt like, kind of, because you have to think about morality a lot. I do think that, just from a moral and philosophical point of view, if you think about good and evil a lot, it does force you into making decisions in your own life. You kind of have to walk the walk as well as talk the talk. So I think that's definitely the case. I'm always trying to do the right thing, but I think we all do. It's just sometimes we don't succeed.
Yeah. Sometimes you're led wrong, I guess. Yeah. Wrong beliefs. Your characters, how do you come up with them? Like, where do they come from? Are they people and people that you've maybe come across in your life, or you've seen or experienced in a coffee shop or something, or where do the characters themselves come from?
Often they come from the time and the setting. So if you're writing a detective novel set in the 1930s in Russia, you kind of have to come up with a Russian detective. And then, the elements that you build into that, kind of you give him a career that stretches back to the First World War, when he's fighting for the Tsar, and then he's fighting for the Red Army in the Russian Civil War, and then he's kind of joins the police force, and so we've got this history, a lot of which involves violence and a lot of which involves great hardship. And, that's kind of, that helps explain why he is in many ways loyal to the Soviet Union, because he's sweated blood and, cried tears for, during its formation. So he can see a lot of positive things that are happening. And so you're kind of looking for an interesting character, and then you construct him accordingly. With the winter Guest, which is the latest novel set in the Irish Civil War, Irish War of Independence. Again, I wanted somebody who had that conflicting loyalty. So I had somebody who had been a British Army officer in the First World War and then returned home, and kind of his sympathies had always been towards Irish nationalism, and he becomes involved on the intelligence side of the IRA, who are fighting against British rule and against people he would have served with in the trenches. So, that conflicting loyalty is really useful for a novel. The fact that he still suffers post-traumatic stress from kind of the things that he experienced in the trenches, as so many people did. That's also useful for the novel. And then he has, I needed him to have some association with the family of the woman who is murdered in the opening chapter in an IRA ambush. And so, kind of, that meant that he had to be of a relatively high social status, and have gone to university with the woman who's murdered. So all of that, kind of just by the needs of the story, it's sort of building the character. And then once you have your central character, then you build the other characters off that to an extent, because once you have a good idea of your central character, then all of the others have to be, there has to be some kind of conflict with the central character. They have to either get in the way, or be in opposition. And then once you've got conflict, you've got an interesting story, because it's forcing him to make difficult decisions. It's forcing him to go through difficult experiences. So it sounds a little bit mathematical to an extent, but the fact is that once characters get going, they take on a life of their own. And there is a kind of magic to writing. I teach writing, so I think about it a lot, but you can't, there is something magical happens when you're writing. Characters come alive. They start doing their own thing. You have to have, kind of lengthy conversations with them to get them back on track. So they do, kind of come to life on the page. I think it's fair to say.
Well, once again, you sort of hit my next question. You just described your characters, how they piece together. So do you start with characters or plot? And either way, it sounds like you don't have it all rough sketched out all the way to the end, that the characters can take over and you change the directions depending upon what they say. Am I interpreting your
Yeah,
response?
I think I always know what the ending is, because if you don't know what the ending is, you don't know what's important to get there. But that ending can change as the story goes along. And I think with one of my novels, with a House of Ghosts, kind of somebody said, "Oh, I knew from the first page who did it," and it's like, well, congratulations, because I didn't know until about 20 pages from the end. So it doesn't always pan out the way that you think it's going to do. Maybe you go for a walk, go for a cycle, and you're kind of thinking about it in the back of your mind, and suddenly you think, oh, actually, if this character does this, then yeah, it involves a little bit of rewriting, but that's a much better story, and you're always looking for the better story.
How much of yourself do you think goes into your characters? Like your main characters?
Well, I think all of your characters have a little bit of you in them, because you're thinking about this character and you're trying to imagine what they would do in this sort of situation. So, whenever I'm writing a scene, whenever I'm writing an interaction between different characters, and I want to kind of look at the scene from each of the characters' different perspectives, because each of them has something different that they want to happen in the book and in the conversation or the whatever's happening on the page. So there's to an extent they all have a little bit of you in them, but me anyway. But then you're kind of, as I said, the kind of magic happens, and they do, they do sort of tell you things or do things that you weren't entirely expecting. And, I wouldn't say that the really evil characters have much of me in them, but I guess I've had to, well.
You relate to them the most, well, we know.
Well, maybe not the mass murderers. But kind of they're, but it's important to kind of try and understand them. And it's important for them to, kind of to think about them and how they got to doing what they're doing and what their motive is for doing what they're doing. It's even the bad guy in a book thinks he's the good guy. It's just he's got different rules to everybody else.
So when you have these lengthy conversations with these characters, are you not doing that out loud when you're out in the public?
No, I'm thinking about them. But kind of they're not entirely within my control. So they, once you put an awful lot of thought into a character, then you say, well, I would like them to do this, but actually this guy would do something else. So I have to roll with that and build the plot around it, because otherwise he's a different character and he doesn't make sense.
Right. How do you experience them then? Is this like a dialogue in your head, or do you see them as a movie, or how does this work for you?
Well, I started off writing screenplays, so my books are definitely movies for me. So it just happens that I can be the DOP, I can do the sound, I can kind of write the screenplay, I can control the actors. Basically, it's all me. And I think that's a great way to write a book. So it's not me having conversations with them as such, but it's me, having to put myself in their shoes. So each of these characters, I have to step into them to an extent and think about what they're going to do in this particular scene. It's kind of like having actors and giving them direction for a scene. Kind of you have to know what they, before you write the dialogue, you kind of have to know what they want to achieve and what their how they're going to behave, how they're going to act. And sounds a little strange, but it's kind of,
yeah. Well, you're not waking up with like muddy shoes by the bed or anything weird, right?
Not so far, but if it happens, I'll come back on and tell you all about it.
Wow. So listen, how do you do social media? Are you really interactive with your readers or followers? Do you like to have them contact you and stuff? And if so, what do you have? What social media? And do you have a website? How do they find you?
They definitely can find me on Twitter, and they can find me on Facebook and Instagram. I have to admit that I love hearing from people. So, people can get in touch with me through my website or on Facebook or whatever. But I have to admit that I haven't been as active as I probably should be recently. I'm stuck in the Spanish Civil War at the moment. So,
Yeah.
I'll get back on eventually.
That'll do it.
Yeah, but that's kind of natural. You gotta have to do that, right? You do have to cut off a lot of the world when you're really involved in writing a story, right?
I think so. I mean, it's I spend a lot of time trying to avoid the internet, because it can be such a massive distraction, particularly for writers, but for everybody, I think. So I have something called Freedom Software, which, when I'm writing, kind of limits me to the internet access for about an hour and a half a day. And, ideally I don't even use that hour and a half. So, but it means that I can catch up with stuff that I need to.
I know.
Check my social media and so on.
Yeah. You kind of got to limit yourself. I find that early in the morning, 5 to 6 in the morning, I do all the stuff I need to for that. And then I've got to got to put it down. Otherwise, it's distraction. Time goes by and you're not, and it takes you off the course of what you're doing, right? So.
Yeah, there's also a big problem for historical writers in that, kind of you can think you've got a character and they're wearing a uniform and you think, oh, I need to see what that uniform would have been. So you can find everything on the internet. But sometimes it can take you a little bit of time to find the right image. But along the way, you will get distracted and suddenly you will find yourself looking at other things that happened in 1937 in Madrid. And kind of that's the biggest threat to me as a writer is kind of disappearing down rabbit holes in the internet. Which,
Now, so what is your website so people can find you?
It's william-ryan.com.
Well, we'll have that up on ours as well so people can find it with one click and in case they forget. And it's been a real pleasure. So our guest, William Ryan, thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, guys. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and thanks for asking such great questions.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the House of Mystery radio show. To find out more about our guests, hosts, or show, go to www.houseofmystery.com.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me? Well, good night. This has been a production of Something Weird Media.
I'll be back.